All right, well, it's fantastic to see everybody. We know that we'll have some people coming in and out, but for those who've just joined, we really want to encourage lots of interaction and questions. So speakers know that they'll present for a few minutes and then we'll open it up to really go in depth and learn more about their awesome work. So thank you to everybody for being here. And I'm very happy to introduce Rachel, who's going to be talking about revisiting the accelerated creation to sustainment model, experiences applying the model across 3 technology-enabled services.
Great. Nice to see everybody. I'll just share my slides. Oops. I think that's right. One sec.
It's showing, just not in presentation mode.
Does that work? Is that right?
Yes. Now you're good.
Great. So I'll talk about 3 projects where we've applied this accelerated creation to sustainment model. So this is a model that was proposed in 2017 by David Mohr and colleagues here. And it's trying to solve or propose a method that could be used to address one of the major problems with evidence-based digital mental health interventions, which is that they may work in trials, but people don't use them in the real world. And the way it gets at that is by integrating an iterative user-centered design process with clinical trial methods through a create phase where you develop the technology as well as a service plan. So someone in an implementation context, in a clinical context, is going to support use of that tool. Then you trial it and ultimately sustain it. So we really wanted to understand, how does this model work when we actually use it, and what are kind of the strengths and possible weaknesses of it? So we monitored challenges and possible solutions, applying ACTS to 3 different projects. This was under a P50 Alacrity Center at CBITS, and I collected data over 5 years. So there were 3 projects that was each centered on a different healthcare context where mental health services are commonly delivered. So primary care, perinatal care, and then home-based care for older adults. And I tried to interview as many folks as I could across all of the projects with diverse roles. So on the research side, the health system side, and then the companies that we worked with to actually develop or adapt, in some cases, the tools that we used. So I want to get into some of the challenges or disruptors to the work. I think this is one that shouldn't be too surprising for people in this space, but for some team members who are newer to digital mental health, it really was. It kind of took them aback how long it took and how complicated it was to align with the developers or the companies on exactly what is in scope for software development. So one person described there had to be trade-offs. The things we were able to create and adapt were really limited. And this really manifested across all 3 projects. This is another one that's pretty common across clinical science, which is recruitment issues. This again popped up across all 3 projects, but kind of unique to the ACTS model, we had these iterative phases of the design process, starting with elicitation and then prototyping and then supposed to be usability testing. But because these delays with recruitment, with software development kind of cascaded, it ended up really putting pressure on those last stages. And in fact, they were really truncated across all projects. Usability testing was pretty minimal or it was cut. And then I think it's kind of the nature of the beast that these are really complex projects with different roles, with people at different stages. And so getting people the information they need across these roles became a major coordination challenge. Getting the people designing the service plan information about the healthcare context, about the scope for the technology, et cetera. And so that led to not everyone having the information they needed at the right time. So what were some of the suggestions for improving how we do this work using ACTS? One thing that I think came across really strongly is how important the technology partners are. And this is something that wasn't part of the model, but really, you know, whether or not you're building a tool from scratch or you're using an existing product, really making sure that 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 the company or the developer aligns with you on the direction that you're going, is willing to use the findings from the design research, and really kind of has a collaborative way of working with the team. And then another kind of finding related to the technology development was making sure that there are team members who can provide support. So project management was a huge piece of the success of these projects. And then also having team members who could serve as liaisons or really support the work with the developers. And then to avoid this squeeze on the usability testing in the later stages of design, is there a way to be really pragmatic in how we are starting the process so we don't get bogged down? So that could be relaxing recruitment criteria early on, drawing on accumulated knowledge if that's appropriate. So there's various ways we can think about that. And then really focusing on sharing learnings across activities and making sure that the leadership is in a position to assess, do we need to pivot to make this work? Do we need to make changes in what we're delivering? So one of the center co-director here said, if I had thought about it earlier, I'd have pushed harder to change the eligibility criteria in this case. So really making sure that you're prepared to pivot. So some implications here. The importance of articulating relationships and expectations across roles, particularly with the developer or the company. And then it's important to recognize, at least in this case where this was NIH-funded work, when these challenges or backlogs were encountered, there was a tendency to default more to the norms from clinical science and make sure you're meeting funder demands. And that really meant we got to run the trial no matter what, so we have to move forward. And then thinking about ways that we can build in flexibility to be able to pivot, change aspects of the project to align with ongoing learnings. So we're working on putting together some guidelines for using Axe from this work. And thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that great talk. I invite people to raise their hand or ask questions in chat or to just unmute. This was fabulous. And while people are getting their thoughts together, I'd love to follow up on your comment about sort of that, constant challenge that comes up in terms of alignment with software developers and those pieces. And one of the things that we have struggled with in our work, and I'm curious how you think about this or what learnings you've had, is that when we get, do human-centered design and get feedback from folks about what they want and do that iterative process, sometimes the things that they're requesting, understandably, they don't understand how heavy a lift that is technically. And so it feels like there's this tension that comes in where, the software developers are put in this position of like, you're asking us to do a giant overhaul, or we feel like we're not being responsive to our potential users and the feedback they're giving us. And I'm just curious, like, anything you've learned about good ways to navigate that tension, because it is hard we don't have shared knowledge of like the asks in some ways.
Yeah, I think across these projects, there was kind of a misalignment between the questions that were asked in the design work and then what was actually possible. And to a certain extent, that might be unavoidable, like you want to invite people to ideate freely. But at the same time, I think if we hadn't just started with elicitation, but really had started and at the same time, at least with working with the developer to understand the constraints, I think the designers doing the design work would have probably scoped their questions differently. So if this tool is going to use sensing technology and it's really going to focus on people who are interested in sensing, we don't need to ask all of the questions about, like, if you were going to build any kind of an app for digital mental health, what would that be? I think they would have narrowed their questions. And so it led to potentially frustration from the participants, but also from the HCI researchers who we partnered with, that they felt like they did a lot of work and then it didn't get used. Yeah, so I think the sequence really of activities and using the constraints of the developer to inform the design work would make more sense.
That's great. Other questions that people have or responses that they want to share? I will say, just following up, one thing that we're playing with to tie to what you spoke of is actually having some of our technical team be at the co-design sessions so that you can get more immediate feedback. But the question is that going to constrain what happens there? So I think we'll see, if that helps or hurts the process kind of thing.
Yeah, I'll be very curious about that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for that fantastic start for presentations. Really appreciate it. And now I'm excited to turn it over to Carolina, and they will be speaking about social support online intervention for sexual and gender minority youth to increase help seeking for anxiety and/or depression, a pilot randomized controlled trial. Let's go.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk to you all about our randomized control trial funded by the NIMHD. So research finds that sexual and gender minority youth, or SGMY, are at an increased risk for depression and anxiety. Simultaneously, SGM youth are less likely to seek help from mental health professionals. This led us to creating an intervention with the aim of increasing mental health help-seeking intention. So in a prior study that we conducted qualitative interviews with 25 SGM youth, finding out that SGM youth use online environments such as Discord to connect with other SGM youth as a part of the mental health help-seeking process. So these youth identified the main barriers to help-seeking as stigma from both SGM identities and other minority identities, concerns about confidentiality and privacy from mental health professionals, difficulty gaining guardian support for health or SGM status, and uncertainty whether mental health professionals will be affirming of SGM status or even competent at addressing SGM-specific concerns. And these directly informed our intervention principles, or IPs, meaning specific content areas or smaller components of an intervention. So our objectives were to identify the acceptability and usability of this new intervention, identify exposure to which IPs increased help-seeking intention, and observe changes in exploratory variables, variables that we believe to be potentially impacting help-seeking. So the follow-up data included 75 teens, 14 to 19-year-olds living in the US, recruited from social media ads. They had at least mild depression and anxiety and were not currently receiving psychotherapy. The majority identified as Black, about half as gender diverse, and most as sexual minorities. Our study was a factorial randomized control trial, so after completing the baseline survey, participants were randomized into one of 16 arms that received between 0 and 4 IPs. IP1 was on intersectionality, IP2 on confidentiality and privacy in healthcare settings, IP3 on educating family and friends about identity, and IP4 finding affirming healthcare providers. These IPs and control information was delivered through separate channels on Discord, and participants were prompted to complete at least one activity from 3 types, rated talk about it or try it, and you can see examples of each over here down below, and that would be for each week across 4 weeks. The control group received video content that we created on the topic of research, and IP groups received IP-relevant videos and text-based websites, and everyone completed 1-month follow-up surveys. So participants rated acceptability highly, notably finding it helpful and affirming of their SGM identity, such as this participant who felt more confident with themselves following the intervention. And on the right over here, you can see a figure with an example of a talk about it activity from the intersectionality IP and a participant post. So they stated that the video helped them realize their internalized queerphobia. Specifically, it's not that being queer that causes mental health issues, it's stigma that's causing these issues. Usability scored above average, with 93% indicating that they would use the intervention more frequently. And as for help-seeking intention, as the first table indicates, there was no significant difference between a specific IP and not receiving that specific IP at 1-month follow-up. However, as table 2 indicates, participants exposed to IP 1, 3, and 4 experienced significant increases in help-seeking intention between baseline and 1-month follow-up. As for exploratory variables, among participants exposed to NIP, there were significant increases in actual help seeking from a mental health professional and significant decreases in confidentiality concerns in therapy sessions. Negative expectancies related to sexual minority status, that'd be something like rejection, and internalized transphobia, or negative attitudes about own gender identity absorbed from negative societal attitudes. And these scores were compared from baseline to 1 month follow-up. However, there were no significant changes in social support or internalized homophobia, and that's similar to internalized transphobia, but regarding sexuality. So, as for limitations, recruitment occurred through social media, which opens up the possibility to potential fraudulent participants. And we took measures to reduce this possibility, such as checking IP addresses through Discord email verification. In conclusion, our intervention showed high acceptability, above average usability, increased mental health professional help seeking intention broadly, and particularly among participants exposed to content on intersectionality, educating others, and finding affirming healthcare providers. And it also impacted variables thought to be relevant to help-seeking intention. So next steps would be to conduct a further developed full-scale randomized control trial combining all IPs and adding chatbot as well as links to community support, as well as having adequately sized control with multiple assessment points to test exploratory variables as mediators, use advanced methods to authenticate recruited participants, and ensure adequate measurements of active, so that would be like looking at posting, versus passive engagement, so that would be just like viewing. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you for that really thought-provoking, fantastic presentation. Really appreciate it. Let's open it up for questions and feedback. And I'm happy to get us started and then excited for others to jump in. I'm really curious when you collected this data. Obviously, it's a particularly challenging time to be doing the important work that you're doing right now. And I'm curious how you think results might be different right now, assuming that you collected it, a number of months ago, and how you might approach it differently and those kinds of things given the challenging times right now.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So this data was collected, I believe last year, like last April. But for sure, like I can definitely see, especially like with the healthcare limitations to gender minority youth under 19. Um, I would say that so our next steps were potentially to introduce the chatbot and having those community links. And I think putting more of an emphasis on gender minority content, especially during this time, would be very, very important. Yeah.
Appreciate that. Alyssa, just a quick answer to your question. All of these talks are being recorded and will be posted probably around the end of June for people to go back and get more information. Tyler, I see a question in chat. Did you want to raise that?
Yeah, sure. Also, great presentation. I'm also from UPMC and Pitt, so glad to see some representation there. I was just curious if you could clarify how many IPs I think they were called each arm received. Did people receive just one? Did people receive a mix? What did that process look like?
Yeah, I can share my screen again. So there were, let me take a look at this. So there were, so 16 IPs, and I have this graph or this table over here, and basically it shows how many IPs each study arm received. So study arm 1, like that was basically our attention control, and they received like 0 IPs, but as you can see across these other 15 IPs, they received different numbers and different combinations of various IPs.
Super cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Absolutely. We have time for maybe one more question before we want to make sure we move on. Do you think Discord has remained the best place to recruit for the samples that you're working with?
So recruitment occurred through Facebook and through Instagram. And basically, yes, but the intervention itself took place over Discord. Um, and the reason why we recruited from social media is just to get more at diverse samples. And Discord was chosen just because it allows for these like separate channels. It
Right.
allows for videos and posting of like text-based resources and having different like chats and everything like that.
Great. And thanks for the additions in chat there. Well, please join me in thanking Carolina for their fantastic and interesting presentation. And excited now to turn it over to Gabriella and Naomi, who are going to be talking about adapting monolingual digital mental health resources for multilingual families, lessons from the Teach system implementation.
For that introduction, can you see our screen here?
It's just coming in and we see it not quite in presenter mode.
Okay, how about now?
Still not presenter mode for me. Now.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be sharing some key modifications that we've made to the Teach system and some of the lessons that we've learned from the implementation. So to begin, what is the Teach system? It is a digital low-intensity treatment for teens with anxiety that was developed in English for English-speaking teens and is implemented across multiple pediatric primary care clinics in Chicago. So for some community context, Chicago is a very diverse city has a lot of multilingual families with over 30% of the population speaking a language other than English at home, and with Spanish being the second most common language spoken within the city. And as you can see in the graph that we have next on this slide, a lot of our Spanish-speaking families reside on the south and west sides communities in which we've implemented the Teach system. So we identified 6 key modifications made during the pre-implementation and implementation phases of the Teach system, which considered cultural context, language, and the needs of the community. The first modification that we're going to present today was to the parental permission forms, where we sent them off to get professionally translated into Spanish, and then were adapted by our bilingual research staff during the pre-implementation phase. And the reasons why we did this was first to ensure that the forms were linguistically equivalent to the English version, and two, to make sure that they were culturally appropriate. So we pulled a specific example from the parental permission form. In the English version, we were trying to communicate the primary risks to participating in this study, which was breaches of privacy. And the initial Spanish translation that we received from the translation services translated that to una violación de privacidad, or a violation of privacy. And for cultural context, violación or violation has a very strong and negative connotation in Spanish. And so keeping this in mind, our bilingual research staff made the edits to have it say una pérdida privacidad, which is a loss of privacy, which still communicates the breaches of privacy, but with a more culturally sound translation. And I think this is a really good example as to why supporting our multilingual families goes beyond just a simple translation.
The second and third adaptations we made is that English-speaking staff were trained to introduce themselves in Spanish with Spanish-speaking caregivers and to present this Spanish infographic that we created that contains information about the study purpose, procedure, and other important info that Spanish-speaking caregivers need to make informed consent for their teens. Sorry, to clarify, not for their teens, but for their teens to participate. Another adaptation was we adapted the way that we engaged with families in Spanish to communicate the purpose and function of the Teach system to ensure that these explanations reflect cultural understandings of mental health held by the Latino community, while also maintaining fidelity to IRB approved language. So say I'm in the clinic space and I'm in the waiting room and I'm talking with a Spanish-speaking caregiver, and I'm trying to convey that the purpose of the Teach system is that it's a tool that offers resources to help teens with anxiety or stress. If I translate this word by word into Spanish, then I would be saying that Teach is a tool that offers resources to help teens con ansiedad o estrés, which implies that it's for teens who have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. This is challenging in multiple ways. One, parents might feel like their teens do not fit the criteria to receive support through Teach, or if their teen does have a clinical diagnosis, they might fear disclosing this information because clinical diagnoses are highly stigmatized in the community. Now, if we add one word, sentimientos, to say that it's a tool that offers resources to help teens con sentimientos de ansiedad o estrés, now we're conveying that it is for teens with feelings of anxiety, of stress, which normalizes these feelings in the community, and also clarifies the eligibility criteria so that more teens can benefit from the Teach system. And another adaptation we made is to the teen assent form. So on the left side, you see our original form, which is multiple pages long. And the right side, we have our adapted one, which is only 2 pages. So we condensed the information in the assent form, but we also changed the language itself to fit a 6th grade reading level because our teens are between 13 and 17 years old. And we want to make sure that information is accessible so that they can make informed consent. But also working in this primary pediatric clinics is very hectic. There's a lot of stuff going on. Patients are being rushed in and out of their rooms, and we want to make sure that they have all the information that they need to make informed consent in the little time that we might be able to engage with them. So some key takeaways about the modifications for the Teach system is that modifications are inevitable at every stage of design and dissemination, and it is essential to consider the ecological context of your participants to ensure that participation is equitable, even when an intervention is intended to be delivered in English. So it's important to be accurate, transparent, and also culturally informed when engaging with multilingual families. And lastly, why do we care? It's because more inclusive modifications may serve as a catalyst to enhance the access and the use of effective digital mental health tools to address mental health disparities experienced by multilingual families.
So thank you for listening to our presentation. If you want to learn more about the Teach system or some of the pre-implementation activities that we did beforehand, you can scan these QR codes. And if you have any questions for us that may pop up later, here are emails as well. So reach out if you have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this really important work. Let's open it up for questions and feedback from the group.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I work in industry and we're always trying to find the most cost-effective ways to do the right thing. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives, if you had very little resources and are starting to translate materials, what's the number one thing you would prioritize in that process?
Great question.
I guess something that I would prioritize, and it's I'm not sure how this would function from an industry perspective, but making sure that there is somebody who is from the community present, who can kind of oversee these materials to make sure that the information is culturally competent. Like how we showed was that you can get these materials to be professionally translated, and that's always an important step because you also don't want that person to have the burden of translating everything because translations do take time. But we just want to make sure that we're not harming communities with the content we're producing. So I think just a cultural competency and making sure that the information is accessible, because also people have different reading levels and educational levels. So making sure that it's lay friendly, that is appropriate, and that is transparent.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so I think just taking a look at who's on your team and who you can reach out to to double check all this information, because again, we're trying to support our families that we're trying to serve, and not do any harm. So language is the first step, ensuring that the language is appropriate.
Thank you for, yeah, sharing this work. And I guess I have an extension of Margaret's question, 'cause, for some work we've done where we tried to do translation and culturally tailoring of a program. One of the things that we got feedback on was based on sort of tended to vary by the age of the user, that they had different preferences for the pronoun use in the program. And then of course, like differences depending on regional dialects and things like that. And I'm just curious, like how you've approached some of those pieces. Our dream is to have like lots of versions that can be like personalized and matched, but we're not there yet. And so I'm just curious, like how you've been managing those pieces.
To be honest, I think it stems from the diversity of our team as well. So I'm a Colombian American and Naomi is Mexican American. And so we'll have a lot of conversations about like, okay, what word can we agree on here? And what are we trying to communicate? We'll have a lot of discussions about like, okay, this word means this to me. What does it mean to like people in your community? So again, I think making sure that your team represents the people that we're serving, right? With diverse experiences, backgrounds, and then kind of reaching like consensus in a way of like what is the best way to communicate the materials that you're trying to translate. But again, I guess getting some input from a little bit of everyone.
And which way did you go on pronouns in particular in terms of the more formal versus less formal and some of those pieces where, at least for us, we did get diverse feedback of what the preferences would be?
Mm-hmm. What would you say?
I would say rule of thumb, so for example, with pronouns like using usted versus tú, that varies a lot by dialect. I always tell Gabby, like, you're so like respectful because you say like usted to everybody. And my family's from like the northern part of Mexico, like Sinaloa. So we have a very strong accent, and we're like tú and hey tú. So I say like in this case, it's always just what is most agreeable, just showing that like respect of usted, even if it's, a child or a teen. It's always important. Also considering our work with teens, there's kind of like a power dynamic where teens are kind of seen as less than adults. So I think the fact that we use usted with them is also kind of validating them and their autonomy. So I would just say, as a rule of thumb, to be respectful of everybody despite their age, using usted is always preferable.
Super helpful. And you have a question in chat before we move on to the last talk about whether the entire teach intervention has been translated.
Good question. So it has not been entirely translated. Again, this intervention was meant for English-speaking teens, but as recruitment began and we were in the pediatric primary clinics, we noticed a lot of engagement with multilingual families. And so, teens come with their parents, and we want to make sure that their parents are okay with their teens participating in research and understand what the research involves. And so that's why we made these adaptations, to provide the family members or caregivers with the information that they needed to feel comfortable with their child's providing consent to participate. And so the teach system has not been translated to the full extent, but I have hopes that will happen in the future, because we have had some teens who prefer Spanish and want to receive these resources in Spanish. So more to come on that, I guess.
And also, so to like clarify, teen parental consent is not necessary for teens to engage with
Oh, nice.
Teach, because teens can also initiate Teach through a self-directed flyer at the clinics. But for example, something that I've noticed with multilingual families is that a lot of times the burden of translation falls on the teen, where they're expected, especially in primary care, to translate very official stuff for their families, and I think that can be so hard on a child. So this was also to kind of alleviate that burden from the teens, and that to make sure that their families are informed of what their teen is participating in. So for example, in clinics, sometimes I'll first address the teen, and if I kind of see their parent give them that look of like, oh, like, what is she saying? Then I'm like, oh, and then I'll like engage with them in Spanish. Just because again, we don't want teens to have to go through that burden, because that's something that is constantly replicated in healthcare.
No, such good points. Really appreciate the important work that you're doing. Fantastic job. Please join me in thanking Gabriella and Naomi, and excited to turn to our last speaker, Lee, and a special shout out. I feel badly that we're having Lee go at the end because it is now after 10:30 p.m. For her, so truly appreciative. But know that we are in for a treat to hear about real world evidence for mood bloom, a facilitating thought progression, FTP-based digital intervention for depression.
Awesome. Cool. I think I'm sharing. Everyone can see that? Awesome. Okay. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Lee, and I'm the Director of Scientific Product and Research at Hedonia. And today I'm going to be presenting real-world evidence for Mood Bloom, which is our digital intervention via mobile app that's grounded in a treatment called facilitating thought progression, which you probably haven't heard of. Maybe you have. I'll refer to it as FTP here, and it's a novel cognitive framework for treating depression and anxiety. So of course, explain that. Okay, so I'll start off with a bit of background. Depression, we know, is not just a mood disorder, but it's also a disorder of thought. And people with depression often get stuck in narrow, rigid, repetitive thought loops. So struggle with rumination, mental inhibition, and having a more constricted perspective. So FTP targets this disorder of thought specifically by encouraging a more broad, far, and fast thinking, and this is to negate that rumination, really encouraging creative thinking to negate the mental inhibition, and encouraging one to see the bigger picture and take on a more global perspective. So looking at the forest instead of the trees is what we like to say. So addressing that constricted perspective that they might have. So overall, you could say that the FTP approach highlights how we think rather than what we think about. And it's supported by decades of accumulated literature, as well as more recent advances in research domains of information processing, creativity, and neural networks. And we actually put this approach to the test in a clinical trial at Massachusetts General Hospital. I'll go into that as well, but making sure that this is actually working on decreasing symptoms of depression and anxiety. Now, you might be wondering what FTP actually looks like in practice. So at Hedonia, we've translated the scientific paradigms from the research that I kind of just very briefly went over into enjoyable and quick mini games, or what we like to call therapeutic games that target those same ideas. So our games here are designed to encourage creating those broader associations, having faster thought progression, and taking on a more global focus. And by making these activities enjoyable and super accessible in an app, we really aim to reach even those with low motivation, which is, of course, also a core feature of depression. So we're hoping that this is an easy way to kind of get people involved. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we ran that single blind RCT with 101 adults with mild to moderate depression. And these adults were randomly assigned to either an intervention group or a waitlist control group. So participants used the Mood Bloom app 4 days per week for 15 minutes a day for 8 weeks in the intervention group. And we repeatedly measured symptoms of depression and anxiety via the MADRS, so that's clinician administered, the PHQ-9, so self-reported symptoms of depression, and the GAD-7 for anxiety. And to like very briefly go over the results, compared to the waitlist control, the intervention group saw a 43 to 45% reduction in depression, which is really exciting. That was via the MADRS and the PHQ-9, and a 25% reduction in anxiety as well. Now, beyond our findings from the randomized control trial, it's still really important for us to continuously collect data amongst our own current users. And this is to really understand how mood bloom affects them over time, and how playing in the wild with a much messier and larger data set actually affects our users. So this involves a data set of around 2,700 players, paying users, and the majority start off playing Mood Bloom showing moderate to severe depressive symptoms. And we asked them to complete the PHQ-2, so a shortened version of the PHQ-9, once a week, starting when they download the app, along with a few other questions about the activities that they engage in throughout the week. So when it comes to depressive symptoms, so the PHQ-2, we see a significant reduction over time playing Mood Bloom, so significant improvements showing up as early as week 3 of play. And those different lines show that the more our users played our therapeutic games, so the more time they spent playing these games over the week, the more significant their improvement was over a 12-week period, although all of those lines are statistically significant. And finally, we were also really interested to know, beyond symptoms of depression, how playing Mood Bloom was actually affecting our players day to day, how it's actually affecting their lives overall. And so we kind of created a measure just based off what we were interested in with clinical psychologists. And so once a week, we ask our users to rate how active they were socially, physically, and how often they felt a sense of accomplishment. And this is kind of compared to their usual as the scale. You can see it on the right. And we saw improvements and continue seeing improvements in each one of these domains over time. Also, those significant changes starting as early as week 3, and then just becoming more and more pronounced over the 12-week period. So that is all I have for today. I wish I could go through more, but if you have any questions beyond this session, feel free to email me. Also, I included Moshe Bar's email, who's kind of he's the originator of FTP in a way. And all of his research has really contributed to this. And also Annie Chadwick, who's on the call. She's our Chief Commercial Officer, and is also happy to answer questions about Mood Bloom. But yeah, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share a bit of our work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely fascinating to see the different types of trials that you've done. And yes, very well done for a 10:30 p.m. presentation, as noted in the chat. Looks like some comments coming in there. Why don't we start with the question in chat? Could this intervention scale to other presentations with the same transdiagnostic vulnerability and maintenance processes? For example, rumination, selective attention, are implicated in anxiety and trauma, so not only in depression. And curious what you're seeing as the boundaries then for the samples that this would be for.
Yeah, so far we specifically target depression and anxiety, and largely depression. We haven't kind of experimented or maybe even just collected data to understand if it would help in other, I guess, circumstances, but anything related to rumination, I would assume would show differences. Because I didn't mention this, but in the randomized control trial, we also had the rumination scale, the RRS, and we saw significant decreases in rumination as well. So I just selected a few outcome variables that we saw, but there was more there. So I would think so, but I wouldn't want to say for sure. So we just stick to depression and anxiety for now, based on the randomized control trial, if that answered your question.
Great. Feel free to raise hand or unmute or drop things in chat while people are adding additional thoughts. Can you go back to the MGH trial just for a moment and talk about like, were they doing this in the context of like also getting treatment as usual, or was it because I think I was partly caught, I did my internship at MGH, and it was pretty rare to have somebody getting treatment for mild depression as like a primary treatment. And so I'm just curious, like, were they getting other conditions treated too, or just like, can you give more context of like what else was happening for their clinical care?
Yes, so they had to, I'm trying to find the slide. They had to hit a specific between mild, a MADRS score of 15 to 34. So not severe depression, but in the I would say
So it
that's
was
mild,
okay.
mild to moderate. And in terms of treatment, we told them to continue treatment as normal. So some people were not engaging in anything. Some people were taking medication. Others were seeing a clinician. Others were doing both. And we saw no significant differences in those different groups, if that makes sense, amongst the intervention and the control groups. But yeah, people were just told whatever they were doing before the randomized control trial to continue and not stop anything or add anything on beyond
And
beyond
it
mood.
didn't matter then if this was an adjunct or standalone in terms of results that you saw.
Yeah, it didn't matter.
Wow, that's amazing. Super interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
You have more questions coming in chat there. What ages have you studied, and are you interested in testing in adolescents?
Very interested in testing in adolescents. Our average age was 32 for the randomized control trial, and that was about this. That's kind of our average age in the wild, I guess you could say, as well. We do have adolescents. It's a smaller age group, I would say. But I don't know if that's also just like a marketing thing where maybe they're not seeing advertisements for this. And so that's a potential avenue that we would love to get into. But yeah, we find that our kind of target audience is typically women in their mid 30s to 40s. And same group of folks who engaged. Oh, sorry. But yeah, definitely interested in testing in adolescents. Did you find the same group of folks who engage with games also completed more surveys? That's interesting. I'll have to go back and look at that. In general, people that are more engaged with our game tend to complete more surveys and just have greater engagement. We don't force them to do anything, so that's totally up to them whether they complete kind of these weekly surveys that pop up for them, but we typically get really good engagement with that.
We have time for maybe one more quick question. Olive had one that impressively is well laid out at what is now nearly 4 a.m. So that's incredible. So if you can answer that one, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, could you share what the development process looked like for the exercises? Yeah, so some have been developed while I've been at the company, others before. Typically, we focus on a module of FTPs. I didn't go into this as much. And then from there, look at the research and see if we can almost adapt exactly a scientific paradigm into a game, and try to adapt it as much as, like, just try to make it into the game as much as possible without changing too much. So we have a therapeutic game called Speed Read where they're reading quickly, and that's with the idea that speeding up reading speeds up thought, which improves mood. And this is based off of a few papers that we read, but there's like a trivia component to it. So they read and then they answer questions about what they just read. So it feels more like a game. So it's essentially the same thing, but we add a question. And so that's kind of how we go about making sure that we're targeting each module of facilitating thought progression, but keeping it engaging enough to where it works and people want to play it and don't hate us too much for the game. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Fantastic. Well, perfect timing. Thank you so much to all of our amazing presenters. Just a fabulous lineup of work. And thank you to everybody for raising such interesting questions. Appreciate, all the fantastic engagement, and encourage people now to move over to one of the Ask an Expert sessions that they're interested in. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks.